It's really good to have each of you to be with us this morning. And I hope you appreciated Greg's prayer as much as I did, because he continually talked about being grateful. And gratitude is the secret to being more positive and being more energetic in life. And I'm really grateful for how his prayer was this morning. And it's good to have Ken and Vicki back. They've been in Alaska for a long time, and though Ken got kicked off of the cruise liner, we can understand why. They wanted to keep Vicki, but not Ken. But we're glad to have them back. And you see Janice is gone, and every time you have an OU home football game, you can know that Janice is going to be over there. And Elizabeth is gone. Part of the reason Elizabeth moved, you may not know this, to Oklahoma is because she loves professional bull riding. Her goal is to own an interest in a bucking bull. And so that's literally true. And she has spent the last 3 days at the PBR and being a part of that. And Susan and I are glad to have all of our family here. I think we've got one missing who may be a little sick this morning, or two missing. Mackenzie's in school at Tahlequah, an optometry school. But they're here for a quick trip because we have a milestone birthday in our family. I really don't even want to make this announcement. Our daughter Jenny has turned 50 years old today. You realize the problem with that, don't you? It shows you, it tells you, and verifies what you see, how old I'm getting. So we're anxious to celebrate Jenny's birthday today. Good news. We have finally moved out of John chapter 13. We have been in John chapter 13 for at least 2 months. And yet it is so very necessary for us to understand John 13 in order for us to begin to understand the beginning, at least, of John 14. It's still only hours away. It is only hours away before Jesus will be betrayed, denied, tried, and crucified. And I want you to remember John chapter 13 through the eyes of the apostles. It's a strange, strange night, because they have seen Jesus in the middle of a supper get up and wash all of their feet. And then he says, you need to wash one another's feet like this if you are going to be successful. And then he, at that same supper, said, one of you is going to betray me. And they're all wondering, well, who is it? Could I be the one? And Jesus identifies it's a man named Judas. And Judas gets up immediately and leaves. And the apostles are watching all this thinking, what? What's happening? And then Jesus says in John chapter 13, I'm going away, and where I am going, you cannot come. And they don't understand that one altogether. And they're confused about why they can't come. And that's when he teaches that very important statement about love. And I don't think they get it, because they're still wondering about his going away. And finally Peter speaks up, and Peter, with the other 10 apostles watching, he said, Lord, where are you going? And why can't we come? I'm willing to die for you. And Jesus says to Peter, before the dawn comes in the morning, you're going to deny me 3 times. How do you think those 11 apostles feel at this moment? Here are some words you might consider, and there are many other words you could put on there. They would be sad. They might be confused. They might be afraid, full of fear. They're unsure. They're uncertain about what's going to happen. What happens then? We've been with Jesus for over 3 years. And if Jesus is gone, what happens to us? And so they're sad, they're confused, they're fearful, they're unsure, they're bewildered, there are other words. And they are wondering what's going to happen. They're full of doubt. And all those words are so very common to us. Am I right about that? Every single one of those words are so very common to us. Because how often do we find ourselves in situations that are so complicated where we doubt and we fear and we struggle and we're bewildered and we're confused and we don't have the answer? And my guess is that some of you have had that situation in the last week. And some of us have had it in the last few days. And it leaves you with this great big word of stress. And this stress and this anxiety takes a toll on your health, and you can't sleep like you ought to be sleeping. And it causes you to worry over and over again, and it makes you irritable. And that in turn takes its toll on people around you, especially in your family. And so I talked to a young woman 2 weeks ago. And I said, what was the reason why you quit your job and went to this other job? And she said, it was so hard. And there was so much stress. And then she said this, and I got really tired of going home, and 2 little boys would ask me, Mama, was the day harder than yesterday? And she said, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to find something else. Now, have I described life pretty well? Have I described how we end up living so much of our lives? As long as you're able to breathe on this earth, you're going to have this kind of situation. And now from John chapter 13, we tiptoe into John chapter 14. And by tiptoe, I mean we barely get into it. We're in verse 1. We're not going past verse 1. And we're going to look at verse 1 out of the New International Version, and we're going to look at verse 1 out of the easy-to-read version. I like the easy-to-read version better. And I don't even have to put it on the screen because you have it memorized. And you may not have intended to memorize it, but you've been to enough funerals where you've heard it. Because it's the number 1, or at least the number fits in the top 3 passages used at funerals over and over again. So listen to what Jesus says to the 11 apostles who are at their wits' end and filled with stress and fear. I just skipped 2 slides. You see that? Burke skipped 2 slides, okay? I'm going to tell you about Burke. Do you realize since the beginning of COVID, I can't think we figured out he's only missed 2 and maybe 3, but 2 Sundays since the beginning of COVID, and it's kept us going and kept us alive. And I send these slides to Burke usually Saturday morning or Friday night, and he can hardly read my writing, and so he comes up with new stuff, and Burke's been magic. He's been magic. And here's what it says out of the New International Version. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Now, if he stopped there, I wouldn't like this verse at all. if he stopped there, I would not like this verse. Because I don't know how many times well-meaning people have come to me and they have said, don't worry about it. And they have said, it'll be okay. Or they have said, it'll all work out some way. And I know these people mean well, and some of these people love me, but I'm going to tell you, it doesn't help me a lot. And I would even go so far as to say is sometimes it makes it worse. Does that shock all of you that say that? How many times have you quit worrying because someone told you to quit worrying? How many times you quit fretting because somebody told you to quit fretting? How many times have you gone to sleep when somebody said you ought to be sleeping instead of worrying? I'm telling you, that doesn't work. But Jesus doesn't stop there because he knows it won't work like that. He says, you believe in God, believe also in me. God is real. I am real. And now we look at the next version. Don't be troubled. Trust in God and trust in me. We are real and we care and we're paying attention. And guess what? With us, all things are possible. And so here I am back to this subject that I've talked about over and over and over again. The only problem is, as old as I am, it is a new subject to me. It may not seem like a new subject to you from me because I talk about it so often, but I spent most of my life not dealing with that subject, not knowing how to do it. And I'm still trying to learn how to do it. But can I give you just, and I know we don't have much time of such a giant subject. Some of you might can remember a time we spent 3 or 4 months every single Sunday talking about trust. But I'll give you a couple of ideas about it. Do you know that it seems to me that trust precedes God working for our good? Think about that. We love Romans 8:28. We love that verse. God works what? All things together for our good, for those who love him. But do you know that it may well be that trust as well as love precedes God working for our good? And if you open the Old Testament, it's on page after page after page. And we could go through the longer, detailed stories, but I'll give you the quick versions of the most popular ones. So you got David, and you got a giant. And David is young, and he's not full grown. In fact, his older brothers are in the army. He is the youngest of the bunch, and so he's taking care of the sheep. And his job connected to the army is to carry messages and carry food. And he goes one day, and there's that guy who really is a giant. Suze told me watching football yesterday, I didn't get home until after 5 o'clock, but she said they announced that one of these linemen was 360 pounds or something like that. And I think it's probably all muscle. He is a little guy compared to Goliath. He's a little guy compared to Goliath. Goliath's over 9 feet tall. And he's been fighting all his life. And no one's ever beaten him. And no wonder every single person in the army is so afraid. And no wonder they're so bewildered. And no wonder they hide behind a rock every time he calls out a threat. Because they know that to walk out there and face Goliath is absolute certain death. And it is. They're going to die if they go out there. And here comes this little bitty guy. And he looks at that and says, I'll fight that guy. You think, this kid's so young. He's so naive. He's crazy. That's what they did think, by the way. But he said, no. He said, what I know is when I walk into this impossible situation, it's not me, it's God. And how do I know that? Because when I was taking care of the sheep, even when I was a bit younger, when I was taking care of the sheep, there was a bear that came. And I can't fight a bear. And yet God gave me victory. And there was another time a lion came. How am I going to fight a lion and win? And God gave me the victory. Well, God take care of that big guy down there. He's too little for armor. So he goes down there, as you well know, and takes a rock and slings it, hits the guy in the forehead. He falls down. He takes the guy's sword and cuts off his head. And he makes it look so simple. But he can turn around and say, hey, fellas behind the rocks, look what God just did. God's always been your answer. And trust from a little guy preceded God working for his good. And you know my favorite story of all. It's become my favorite story. It's Daniel when he's an old man. It's Daniel when he's an old man. And the king gets all tricked. And because of it, Daniel's forced to go into a den of lions. He's too old to fight. Couldn't fight those hungry lions anyway. And when he goes into that den of lions, all he can do is look to God and say, if you're through with me, then this is the way I perish. If you're not through with me, I'm not sure how you're going to work this out, but it's up to you. And the lions can't get their mouths open. Doesn't it make a big smile come across your face? He's lifted out of there and nothing's wrong with him. And the trust precedes God working for his good. And over in the New Testament, Paul and Silas have been unjustly, in a city called Philippi, beaten. I mean, really beaten. And they've been unjustly and wrongly put in a prison. And they've been stuck in this prison in such a way they can't possibly get out. If they're locksmiths, they can't get out. Their feet are fastened in stocks. There's jail door after door after door. And besides there's a jailer. And who knows their fate for tomorrow? Have you ever thought about that? Who knows their fate tomorrow? And I would be looking at my fellow sitting next to me thinking, what in the world are we going to do? We're in a big mess. And I would be worried. And I would be anxious. And I wouldn't be able to sleep. And those guys sing. And those guys pray. And those guys act like it's no big deal. And they trust. God, you got us into this. We came here for your purpose. You gave us this assignment. We're here because of you. Is this what you intended? Do we die tomorrow? And God says, no, you don't. And he sends a most unusual earthquake, and they're set free. And trust precedes God working for our good. And yet that all sounds really great, doesn't it? And yet I still don't know how to do it. I still don't know how to do it. So I can tell you what has to happen. And I haven't gotten it all worked out yet, even for myself, I'm telling you. But trust must become a habit. Your confidence, your trust, your belief in God, your belief in Jesus has to be, that's why the relationship is so important. You can know, and I'm not saying you shouldn't know, but you can know verses, and you can know books of Bible, and you can know names, and you can know, and not have a relationship. There was a book written years ago. He's a famous author still today named Malcolm Gladwell. But this book was called Outliers. And he was trying to figure out how is it that some young men become outstanding athletes when other young men with maybe just as much talent never reach the top. So he started studying hockey players in Canada. That was his premise that he began the study, with which he began the study. And what he found was that the hockey players that made it to the National Hockey League were always older, almost always predominantly older when they started school. Sometimes 9 months older. And so that early in life, 9 months, made them a little stronger, made them a little bigger, and made them get more playing time. And then he began to look into the playing time. And he said because they had more playing time, they just got better and better. And so he developed what he called the 10,000 hour rule. That's a story of Tiger Woods. Now, I don't hold him up as much of an example to you, but I'm telling you, for a while, he was the big name in golf. I don't know much about golf. It's still strange to me why some, even in this audience, like to hold some little club and hit some little white ball and try to figure out where it went, and spend hours doing it, and ultimately try to get in some kind of little hole out there that is only that big. I mean, this makes no sense. And yet for a while, he's at the top of his game, and he's winning green jackets and doing all this. And yet then you read the story, and when he's a toddler, his dad has him with the golf club, and he gets in his 10,000 hours. And my favorite story Gladwell tells is the Beatles. Gideon doesn't know what the Beatles are. He thinks of something crawls on the ground. But I'm telling you, when I was a teenager, they landed in America. I think I saw them on the Ed Sullivan Show. That tells you a bunch about my age. The first time. And when they landed in America, it was like overnight rage success. Like out of nowhere. And he said, what people don't know is that they spent years and years in England. And they would play nightclubs 6 and 7 nights a week. And some of those nightclubs were 24-hour-a-day nightclubs. So they were day clubs and nightclubs. And he said they would sing so long that their voices could no longer even speak. And they did it year after year after year. They got their 10,000 hours in, and then suddenly they walk into America like they've been brand new, and here they are. And he said, it never works that way. Now, let me tell you about trust. It's the 10,000 hour deal. It's day after day after day after day of me looking at God and saying, I again don't have the answer. And there's a problem with health in my family, and there's a problem in the finances in my family and in my life, and there's a problem where I work, and it's too big, and I'm anxious, and I can't sleep, and I'm irritable, and I'm making people around me miserable, and I need you to help me. And I know you can help me. And you do that day after day after day after day. in little tiny circumstances and sometimes in great big ones. And you just make it a way of life. Until finally you get like these apostles. You see, they've been struggling with it for over 3 years. They're trying to learn how to trust. Before the deal's over, before you get through the book of Acts, they're rock solid. They're in bad situation after bad situation. God, it's up to you this time. It's up to you. It's what you want. I have an old friend who's long been dead, a self-taught Greek scholar. He said, Ken, that passage, the way I read the Greek, is not easy in its reading. It's not this soft, easy thing that I do at a funeral. In his opinion, it's his opinion, he said, Jesus says, you stop it. You stop the worrying. It's time for you to understand you've got to trust in me and you've got to trust in my Father. With us, all things are possible. We're going to take care of you. Live like we're going to take care of you. I don't know if my friend's right or not, who's long since been dead. But I've never forgotten him saying that. So, Ken, it's time to shape up. It's time to start trusting. Not just when he gets in a crisis, but all the while. So when it gets to the crisis, I can still sleep. See, Jesus came for one primary purpose. That was to wash away my sins and your sins. But he also came to give us a better life. And this is a better life story.